The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a cloudy Tuesday. Officer Darren Holt had just finished his lukewarm coffee and was sitting in his patrol car on Maple Ridge Drive, flipping through radio channels out of boredom, when the dispatch crackled to life. Unit 2 to 14, respond to a welfare check at 1427 Willow Lane. Elderly female. No contact in 3 weeks. Mail stacking outside. Neighbor concerned. He stared at the house number written on his notepad. Another welfare check. 90% of these were nothing. Someone forgot to charge their phone. Someone else was just avoiding family. Still, the address sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. Copy that, en route, he said into the radio, putting the cruiser into gear. Willow Lane sat on the quiet side of town. The kind of street where time moved slower, and the houses still wore the same paint from the early 2000s. Nothing ever happened here, and yet, everything felt just a bit too still today. As Darren pulled up outside 1427, he noticed the details instantly. Mail bursting from the small black box by the front gate. A milk bottle on the step, still sealed, but covered in dust. Curtains pulled so tight that the glass looked painted. He walked up the path slowly, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The house was old but kept in decent shape. Pale blue paint, chipped in places. A wind chime clinked lazily near the porch. Everything was still. Too still. He rang the doorbell. No answer. Knocked. Ma'am? This is Officer Holt with the local PD. Just checking in. No sound. Not even a floorboard creak. He tried again, louder. Still nothing, until he heard it. A sound so faint he almost convinced himself he imagined it. It wasn't a voice, not quite. A breath, maybe. A shuffle. Something alive. Instinct kicked in. He stepped back and radioed for backup. Dispatch, I need a secondary unit at 1427 Willow. Possible unresponsive resident inside. Requesting permission to enter. 10-4, unit dispatched. Proceed with caution. 5 minutes later, Officer Lena Ramirez pulled up beside him. Tall, calm, and always sharper than most. Darren briefed her quickly, then together they tried the doorknob. Locked. They circled the house, peering into the narrow slits between the curtains, but saw nothing inside. There was no sound, no motion. Just that uneasy sense that something wasn't right. Finally, with a nod between them, they pried the door open with a crowbar, forcing the lock. The smell was the first thing that hit them, not the smell of death, as Darren had feared, but something older. Like stale air and mildew, mixed with dust and a hint of something metallic. Time had collected in the air like fog. Inside, the living room looked frozen in time. Floral-patterned couches, covered in plastic. Doilies. A black and white TV with knobs. Every surface covered with knickknacks. Porcelain birds, faded picture frames, crystal bowls filled with hard candy now fused together by age. Darren moved cautiously. Police, he called out. Is anyone here? No answer. He stepped further in, and that's when he saw her. In the far corner of the room, in a wooden chair that faced the wall, sat a woman. Old. Very old. Frail arms. Wrinkled hands resting in her lap. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose bun. She didn't turn toward the sound of their entrance. Her eyes were open. Ma'am? Darren said, walking slowly toward her. Are you all right? She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. But she was breathing, just barely. Shallow. Delicate. Officer Ramirez reached her side first and gently touched her shoulder. Ma'am, we're here to help you. You're safe now. Can you hear me? Then, without turning her head, the woman spoke. Her voice was dry, raspy, but steady, like someone who hadn't spoken aloud in a very long time. "You're too late." They froze. Ramirez shot a look at Darren. "Too late for what?" he asked gently, crouching to her level. She blinked slowly. Her gaze didn't shift from the wall. And then, they saw it. The entire wall in front of her, from floor to ceiling, was covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Old and new. Some black and white. Others faded Polaroids. Each photo was taped, pinned, or in some cases nailed into the wall. Overlapping. Layered. Faces everywhere. Men. Women. Children. Smiling. Serious. Crying. Some faces were circled in red. Others had black X's drawn across them. There were handwritten notes too, scribbled words beneath certain images. Dates. Cities. Phrases like, "still missing," "she knew," "no1 believes," and in one corner, in shaky capital letters, "Do not trust the man in the hat." The woman finally turned her head slowly toward Darren, and he could see the depth in her eyes, a sadness so heavy, it felt almost unbearable. "He found me," she whispered. Darren swallowed. "Who found you?" The woman didn't answer. She closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. Ramirez walked along the wall, scanning the photos, her expression hardening. "There's something about this," she said. "These aren't just family pictures. Look at this." She pointed to a photo, a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with a missing persons flyer taped beneath it. The date, 1984. And another one. A teenage boy, also listed as missing. 1992. Another. 2001. Dozens of them. "Are these all missing people?" Ramirez whispered. Darren's pulse was rising. He scanned the photos again, recognizing one. A woman from a case 5 years ago. She was never found. Another one caught his eye, a man who went missing 3 towns over just last year. "What is this?" he muttered. The old woman began to tremble. "I tried to stop it," she said. "But no one would listen. Not when it mattered." Her breathing was shallow. Darren called for paramedics immediately. As they waited, she whispered one last thing, barely audible. "In the basement, the truth is there. But you won't like it." Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into the chair. The paramedics arrived minutes later and stabilized her, but she remained unconscious. The house was officially declared a crime scene. Detectives were called. Photos were taken. Darren stood at the edge of the porch, staring back at the house. That chill in his spine hadn't gone away. Something about the photos, the XS, the message about the man in the hat, it all felt bigger than anything he'd ever dealt with. And whatever was waiting in the basement, he wasn't sure he wanted to see it alone. But he would. Because whatever this was, it was far from over. The house was quiet again. The only sound was the whirring of a fan that still clung to the corner of the living room, pushing around stale air. The woman, whose name they still hadn't learned, lay motionless in the ambulance outside. Her pulse was faint, but the doctors were hopeful. They said she might wake up, though no one was sure when. But Darren couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened here, whatever twisted story was hidden in this house, wasn't over yet. He stared at the basement door, standing alone in the far corner of the room. It was just a small, wooden door, innocuous, like any other door leading to a basement. But the woman's final words echoed in his mind, sharper than any command he'd ever received. "In the basement, the truth is there. But you won't like it." The chill ran down his spine again. Darren, Ramirez's voice broke his focus. He turned to see her standing by the front window, peering out into the darkening street. "They're taking her to the hospital. We've got detectives on the way, but you know they'll be hours. You think we should check the basement?" Darren didn't answer right away. His instinct told him that whatever was in the basement was dangerous. There was something about the woman's warning that made him uneasy, something buried under layers of time and secrets. But his gut also told him that if he didn't look now, if he didn't uncover the truth while it was still fresh, the chance would slip away forever. "Yeah," he finally said, "let's take a look." They walked over to the door. It was old, its edges worn from years of neglect, the wood warped slightly as if it hadn't been opened in ages. Darren placed his hand on the handle and turned. The creak it made seemed louder than anything he'd ever heard in his life. The stairs beneath were steep, narrow, and covered in shadows. As they descended, the smell from earlier grew stronger, a mixture of mildew, dust, and something metallic. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. Their footsteps echoed around them, unnervingly loud, as if they were disturbing something ancient. The basement was cold, unnaturally so. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak light over the cramped space. The first thing Darren noticed was the concrete floor, which seemed too smooth, too untouched. Dust had gathered in every corner. But the floor was inexplicably clean, as if it had been scrubbed recently. He scanned the room. There were a few old boxes stacked in the far corner. But it was the center of the basement that caught his eye, a large, wooden chest, the lid slightly ajar. Ramirez moved toward it, hesitating as her fingers brushed the top. She glanced at Darren. "You ever get the feeling," she said, her voice low, "that we're not supposed to be here?" Darren's throat tightened, but he nodded. This whole place, from the woman to the photos to the basement itself, felt like a puzzle, one where the pieces had been deliberately hidden, buried under years of time. Without another word, Ramirez pulled open the lid. Inside, there was nothing at first. Just empty space. But as she leaned closer, Darren could see something wedged in the corner, something wrapped in a thick, yellowed cloth. Slowly, cautiously, Ramirez reached in and pulled it out. It was a book. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages fragile. It looked like something from another century, the kind of thing you'd find in an old library or an attic, covered in dust. Ramirez flipped it open, and Darren could hear the spine crack under the weight of the motion. "Looks like some kind of diary," Ramirez murmured, scanning the pages. Her eyes widened slightly. "What's it say?" Darren asked, taking a step closer. "It's weird," she said slowly, her voice trailing off. "The first few pages are filled with names, all crossed out, but some underlined. And then..." She flipped to another page. "Look at this," Ramirez said, turning the book so Darren could see. On the page, in thick black ink, were a series of dates. They seemed almost random, but the more Darren looked, the more familiar they became. They matched the dates on the photographs from the wall. "These are the people from the photos," Darren said, his voice shaking. "The ones who went missing." "Exactly," Ramirez said, her face pale. "But there's more. These notes." She skimmed through the pages. They seemed to be tracking the missing people, their movements, their last known locations. It's like someone was following them, writing down everything they did. Darren felt a cold rush run through him. Someone was hunting these people. "Who's doing this?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. Ramirez didn't answer. She flipped further through the book until her hand froze on a page. Darren leaned in. On the page was a sketch. A crude drawing, but detailed enough to make Darren's stomach tighten. It was of a man, tall and thin, with a long, wide-brimmed hat. His face was indistinct, just a shadow. But what caught Darren's attention was the red X drawn through the figure's chest. The note below it read: "He watches. He waits. He takes. Do not trust the man in the hat." Darren's heart pounded in his chest. The man in the hat. The warning. It had been there, right in front of them. But neither of them had connected the dots. The woman's warning. The photos on the wall. And now this. He stepped back from the chest, his mind racing. This was bigger than he thought. This wasn't just an elderly woman with a strange collection of photos and notes. This was a pattern, one that spanned years, maybe even decades. And someone, maybe more than one person, had been hunting these people, tracking them down like prey. The book was their map, their guide. But what was their endgame? "Do you think she's telling the truth?" Ramirez asked, closing the book carefully. Her voice was strained, unsure. Darren didn't answer immediately. His instincts told him the truth was darker than anything he could imagine. But then again, there was something about the woman's eyes, something about her final words that made him believe that she knew the real story. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to keep digging. And fast. Because this is far from over." The air in the basement felt even colder now, as if they had disturbed something that shouldn't be disturbed. And then, just as they were about to leave, something caught Darren's eye. A small, glinting object near the edge of the room. He moved closer, kneeling to pick it up. It was a key, an old-fashioned key, with intricate engravings on its handle. There was something unsettling about the way it shimmered in the dim light. "What's that?" Ramirez asked, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know," Darren said, his fingers closing around it. "But I think we need to find out." The key was cold in Darren's hand. It felt like an object that had been waiting for him to find it, a piece of some larger puzzle that was only beginning to unfold. The engraving on the handle was faint, worn from age, but there was a shape to it, a symbol, maybe. A line with a loop, an eye, and a strange, almost spiral-like swirl beneath it. He turned it over in his hand, hoping for some kind of answer, but there was none. "It doesn't look like it belongs to the house," Ramirez said, still looking around the basement. "It's too old. And besides, there's nothing here that even looks like it would need a key. We already opened the door." Darren didn't answer. His thoughts were too heavy. That sketch of the man in the hat. The warning. The connection to the photographs. Everything was starting to spiral in on him, like the threads of a broken web. It wasn't just about the missing people anymore. It was about a much larger mystery, something that had been buried for far too long. Ramirez took a few steps around the room, her eyes scanning the walls, the floor, every crack and crevice. Darren felt a deep unease that he couldn't shake, something pressing on his chest, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Do you think the woman's really okay?" he finally asked, turning to face her. "I mean, she hasn't woken up, and we're only scratching the surface here." Ramirez's gaze softened. "She's been through something. And I don't think it's just the isolation. She's been hiding something, Darren. But I don't know if we'll ever get the full story from her." Darren nodded grimly. It was clear that this was no ordinary missing persons case, no simple welfare check. There was something much darker at play, something that went deeper than they could have imagined. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from upstairs, snapping them both out of their thoughts. "That'll be the detectives," Darren said, pocketing the key. "We should let them handle the rest of the house for now." But even as he spoke, a thought gnawed at him. That key. The engraving. It had to mean something. And if the woman had hidden it in the basement, of all places, it was no coincidence. With one last look around the basement, Darren made up his mind. He needed to find out what that key unlocked. He was already in too deep. There was no turning back. They emerged from the basement, the key still burning a hole in Darren's pocket, and walked toward the front door. The detectives had arrived, Detective Andrews and his partner, Detective Hayes, both veterans of the force, both as serious as they came. Darren. Ramirez, Andrews greeted them, nodding toward the door. What's the situation? We've got a strange one, Darren said, stepping aside to let them in. We found a woman in the house. She's unresponsive right now, but we did find some disturbing things in the basement. Disturbing? Like what? Hayes asked, looking over at Darren. Photographs. Names. Notes, Ramirez said, glancing at Darren. We think the woman's been tracking missing people for years. Andrews raised an eyebrow. Tracking? How? Like a map. A diary. Dates. Places. People who've disappeared. And, Darren trailed off. There was a sketch. Of a man. A tall man, wearing a hat. The man in the hat? Andrews said, his expression shifting slightly. Did she mention anything about him? Darren and Ramirez exchanged a look. She did, Ramirez replied. Just before she passed out, she said, "You're too late," and something about the truth being in the basement. We found that key there. Andrews raised a hand, signaling for silence. All right. We'll take it from here. You two stay back and let us do our work. We'll need to get a search warrant for the rest of the house, but we'll start with what you've uncovered. Darren wanted to protest, to press the matter further, but he knew Andrews was right. They had uncovered enough for the detectives to take the lead. For now. But there was still the matter of the key. And something inside Darren told him that the detectives weren't going to find what he was looking for. They weren't going to dig deep enough. Not the way he would. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked toward the back of the house, toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. Ramirez followed him, though she didn't speak, knowing exactly what was on his mind. The second floor was quieter, the air thick with the weight of secrets long buried. The hallway was narrow, with doors leading to small bedrooms, each one as still and silent as the last. Darren's hand instinctively went to the pocket where the key lay, feeling its weight once more. At the end of the hallway was a small, wooden door, just like the basement door. The paint was chipped, the frame slightly warped. Darren approached it, his hand hovering over the knob. His mind raced, trying to piece together why he was drawn to this particular door. Are you sure about this? Ramirez asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Darren admitted, glancing at her. But something tells me it's not just the basement that has answers. There's something hidden here. Something we haven't found yet. He pushed the door open, and they stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The space was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and piles of books. But there was something else that stood out. A large, antique mirror positioned against the wall. It was odd. Out of place. But what caught Darren's attention was the fact that the mirror had been moved recently. The dust around it was disturbed, the marks on the floor still fresh. He approached it cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection staring back at him wasn't just his own. It was something else, a shadow in the background. A figure, standing just outside the edge of the mirror's frame. Darren spun around. There was no one behind him. What the hell, he whispered. But when he looked back into the mirror, the shadow was gone. Ramirez saw the look on his face and stepped closer. What's wrong? Darren didn't answer. He just stepped toward the mirror, his heart pounding. It was ridiculous, but the figure had seemed so real. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something else. He placed his hand on the surface of the mirror, feeling the coldness seep into his fingertips. Then, suddenly, a soft click echoed through the room. The mirror began to shift, slowly moving forward, revealing a narrow hidden passageway behind it. A dark, winding tunnel leading deeper into the house. Darren's heart raced. He stepped back, his mind reeling. This wasn't part of the original layout. This was something hidden, something that had been deliberately concealed for years. Ramirez was already moving toward the passageway. This doesn't feel right, Darren. But Darren was already walking toward it. No turning back now. The passage was narrow, claustrophobic. The walls were lined with old brick, their surfaces damp and cold to the touch. The air grew heavier with each step, and Darren could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the weight of what was happening sinking into his bones. The tunnel twisted, narrowing as it descended deeper into the house, like a vein of some long-forgotten secret. Darren's flashlight flickered in the dark, casting long shadows across the walls. He kept walking, Ramirez close behind, not daring to speak. The passage ended at another door, this one made of old, rotting wood. Darren's hand trembled as he reached for the knob, turning it slowly. The door creaked open with an eerie, almost deliberate slowness. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal, was an object. It was a book. But not just any book. This one was ancient, bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. The symbol on the cover was unmistakable. The same symbol that had been etched into the key. Darren stepped forward, his hand reaching for it. He felt a wave of cold wash over him as he touched the cover. And just as his fingers made contact with the book, the floor beneath them shuddered. The floor beneath Darren and Ramirez trembled again, more violently this time. It was as if the entire house was alive, shifting, groaning, reacting to something hidden deep within its walls. Darren stumbled, his hand gripping the edge of the pedestal for support, but the cold sensation of the book under his fingers remained. The moment was unsettling, like stepping into a new world that had been kept sealed for too long. Ramirez reached out, her voice sharp with caution. "Darren, get away from it. Something's wrong." But Darren didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, as if the book had a pull on him, a force that he couldn't resist. He ran his hand across the surface of the leather, feeling its texture. It was smooth, yet worn, its corners frayed from age. There was something ancient about it, something that spoke of centuries of untold stories. The tremor in the floor stopped as abruptly as it had started, but the tension in the air remained thick. Darren pulled his hand back from the book, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Ramirez grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "We need to get out of here, Darren. This is bigger than we thought. This is dangerous." But Darren was already turning the book over in his hands, eyes scanning the cover for any clue, any answer. The symbol, the same one that had been etched into the key, the one that had appeared in the drawings, was there again, faint but unmistakable. It was an eye, circled by a twisting spiral, like the kind you'd see in old alchemy symbols, or ancient mystical texts. "What the hell is this?" Darren whispered to himself. He ran his fingers over the symbol, feeling a strange tingling sensation. This isn't just a house. This is something else. This was never just about her. "What are you talking about?" Ramirez asked, her voice tinged with alarm. "Darren, come on. We need to leave." But Darren could already hear the soft whisper of his own curiosity urging him forward. He had come too far now, and there was no turning back. He sat down in front of the pedestal, opening the book carefully. The pages were brittle, but they felt alive, almost as if they had been waiting for someone to read them again. The first page was covered with strange markings, symbols, runes, things that didn't make any sense to him at first glance. He turned to the next page, and his eyes widened as he saw a list. It was written in a language he couldn't understand, but there was one word he recognized: subject. The list stretched on for pages and pages, and the longer he looked at it, the more it seemed to echo in his mind. Subject 1. Subject 2. Subject 3. Each subject had a corresponding date, a location, and a number, some marked with a X and others left blank. What the hell is this? Ramirez repeated, stepping closer. What are you reading? I don't know, Darren said, his voice low. But these names, these are the people from the photographs. The ones we saw on the wall. Ramirez leaned over, her breath catching as she saw the same names and dates that had been in the woman's photographs. This is a record. But what for? What's the purpose? Darren turned another page. The next page was different. There were drawings, not just simple sketches, but intricate designs, lines that seemed to connect one figure to another. Figures dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by shadows. In the center of the page was the same man in the hat, standing taller than the rest, with an empty space beside him. The accompanying note was chilling. The Watcher. He who collects the lost. The key to the gate lies in the hands of the chosen. The time is near. Darren felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He scanned the page again, his mind racing. The Watcher, the man in the hat. He was more than just a figure from the photographs. He was part of something bigger, something ancient. The gate? What gate? What did this have to do with the woman they had found? And why did the key seem to be connected to all of it? Before Darren could make sense of it, the room shifted again. It wasn't just the floor this time. The walls seemed to close in, the space growing smaller, more claustrophobic. It felt as though something inside the house had sensed the disturbance, that they had uncovered a piece of a much larger puzzle. The air was thick with the weight of it. Ramirez backed up, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Darren, we need to go. Right now. But Darren couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the pages before him, unable to tear himself away from the strange words, the drawings, the symbols that seemed to pull him in deeper with each turn. I can't leave, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I need to understand this. I need to know what's going on. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, shaking the house to its core. The ground beneath them jolted, and the sound of something heavy moving through the upper floors reverberated down the stairs. What the hell was that? Ramirez shouted, her voice sharp with panic. That wasn't normal. Darren didn't answer. His eyes were still fixed on the book, but the tremors in the house were growing stronger. It was as though the house itself was responding to the contents of the pages, reacting to the things Darren had uncovered. Then, it happened. The room around them seemed to warp. The walls rippled, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The air grew thick and suffocating, the light dimming as though the sun had been swallowed by an unseen force. The key in Darren's pocket began to vibrate, sending a sharp, pulsing sensation through his body. He reached for it instinctively, pulling it from his pocket. When he held it in his hand, it glowed. A soft, eerie glow emanated from the intricate engraving, the eye and the spiral swirling with an otherworldly energy. The light grew stronger, the glow pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to match Darren's heartbeat. Darren, Ramirez's voice trembled. What's happening? What is that thing? I don't know, he murmured, his voice distant. But I think it's connected to this, to everything. The room seemed to expand suddenly, the walls fading away as though they were made of smoke. Darren and Ramirez were standing in a vast, empty space, or was it a different room? The ground beneath them had become solid stone, rough and cold. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into shadows. Darren took a step forward. The key in his hand pulsed again, a steady beat echoing through the stone. He felt as though the air itself was alive, thick with presence and weight. And then he saw it. At the far end of the space was a door, its shape unlike anything Darren had ever seen before. It wasn't a typical door. This one was made of brass, intricately designed with symbols that matched those in the book. The door was huge, towering, and appeared as though it had been crafted eons ago. The glow from the key intensified as Darren walked toward the door, the rhythm of the pulse quickening. "No, Darren, stop!" Ramirez shouted, running after him. "We don't know what's on the other side." But Darren didn't hear her. His entire focus was on the door, and the truth it might unlock. He had to know what was behind it. He was compelled. He reached for the brass handle, which was cold to the touch. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground beneath him shuddered again. The air crackled with energy, the pulse from the key sinking with a deep, otherworldly hum that seemed to emanate from the door itself. With a deep breath, Darren turned the handle and pulled the door open. Beyond it was darkness. But not just any darkness. This was a void, an endless stretch of blackness that seemed to consume everything, swallowing light, swallowing sound. It was as though the door had opened to something that shouldn't exist, a place that defied the very nature of reality. And as Darren stepped forward, the key flared, its glow casting long shadows into the abyss. Darren's fingers gripped the brass handle with an ironclad determination, but inside, his mind was screaming to turn away. The darkness beyond the door was not just the absence of light. It was something more sinister. It felt like the door itself was an entrance to something much older, much deeper than anything he had ever encountered in his years on the force. He took a step forward. His foot met cold stone, but it wasn't the stone of the house, nor the earth he was familiar with. The air was different, thick with a strange weight that made it difficult to breathe. It felt as though the space around him was expanding, growing larger with each step he took. Behind him, Ramirez hesitated. "Darren, this isn't right. We shouldn't be here. We don't know what this is. We don't even know what we're walking into." Her voice, filled with a rare panic, reached Darren only faintly. He had stepped into the abyss, and every instinct in him told him to keep going. There was something pulling him, like a magnet, drawing him further into the darkness. But as his foot touched the ground, a low hum reverberated through the air, soft but growing in intensity. The sound vibrated through his chest, a persistent buzzing that seemed to come from the very walls, or perhaps from the shadows themselves. It was a presence, an awareness, as though something had been watching him since he had first set foot in the house. Ramirez stepped up beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "Darren, please, don't." But Darren didn't turn around. He was focused on the abyss in front of him, the darkness that beckoned. His mind, flooded with the memories of the book and the symbols, seemed to pulse with recognition. The Watcher. The gate. The time was near. The key in his pocket began to pulse again, thrumming with an energy that made his skin prickle. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. As soon as he held it in his hand, it began to glow, the engraving on it brightening with a soft golden light. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain: the key was connected to the darkness. It was connected to the door. Without thinking, Darren raised the key in front of him, the light from the key cutting through the darkness. And then, the hum stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Everything went still. There was no longer just darkness before them. The abyss started to take shape. Slowly, it began to form, like liquid darkness pooling in front of him, twisting and curling, becoming something tangible. It was as though reality itself had been bent in this place. Darren couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The void was alive. It moved. It was growing, stretching outward into an endless expanse, its boundaries stretching as far as he could see. And then, out of the shadows, something appeared. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, stretching out from the shadows like skeletal fingers. The man in the hat. Darren's breath caught in his throat. The figure stood completely still, as though waiting, watching. The man's face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His coat was dark, ragged at the edges, as though it had been worn for centuries. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. His eyes, when Darren dared to look, were not eyes at all. They were black holes, voids that seemed to swallow everything around them. Ramirez gasped behind him, but Darren didn't turn around. His gaze was locked on the figure, and everything else, the room, the space, the world around him, seemed to fall away. The hum in the air returned, but now it was different. It was no longer a gentle vibration. It was a loud, resonant pulse that rattled the bones and filled Darren's head. The darkness seemed to throb in time with the sound. The man in the hat tilted his head, as though observing them. And then, slowly, he raised his hand. At first, Darren thought he was going to gesture for them to come forward. But instead, the figure simply pointed toward the darkness. The shadows twisted and formed into a shape, a door. It was just like the one in the house, the one they had opened. But this one was not of brass or wood. This was stone, rough and ancient, covered in symbols so intricate that Darren's mind refused to comprehend them. Some seemed to move, to shift, as though they were alive. Without a word, the figure stepped back into the shadows. Darren's heart raced as he stared at the door. His hand gripped the key, its glow still pulsing with intensity, urging him forward. Ramirez grabbed his arm, her voice frantic now. "Darren, we have to go. This is madness. We don't know what we're doing. This is not just a house anymore. This is something else." But Darren shook his head, his jaw set. "I have to know, Ramirez. We have to know." Without another word, he stepped forward, the key held tightly in his hand. The moment his fingers touched the stone door, the ground beneath him shuddered, and the world seemed to warp. The symbols on the door shifted, rearranging themselves in an almost hypnotic dance. The humming grew louder, deafening, and Darren felt a pull, a force dragging him toward the door. His body was no longer his own, the key in his hand seemed to control him now, pulling him forward, guiding him. "Darren!" Ramirez screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the door slowly opening. The darkness beyond was no longer just a void. There were shapes in it now, silhouettes of things Darren couldn't name, things that twisted and flickered just beyond the reach of his vision. But they were real. They were alive. The man in the hat stepped back into the shadows, his presence fading as the door creaked open fully, revealing the abyss beyond. Darren stepped into the doorway. The air in this place was colder than anything he had ever felt before. It was like stepping into the mouth of a glacier, a place where time didn't exist, and the world outside was a distant, irrelevant memory. The darkness wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket, and the hum was no longer just a sound. It was a feeling that resonated deep in his chest. The key in Darren's hand grew hotter, almost unbearably so, its light flashing in time with the pulsating hum. He couldn't let go of it. It was as though it had become a part of him, as though it was tied to his very soul. Ramirez, pale and trembling, stood just behind him. She didn't know what to say, but her presence was a silent plea for him to turn around, for them to leave. But Darren couldn't. He couldn't abandon this. The darkness ahead of him seemed to move, to shift, as though the very air itself was alive. He could feel eyes on him, watching him. Waiting. And then, as though summoned by his thoughts, something emerged from the shadows. It was a figure, not the man in the hat, but something far worse. A twisted shape, like a shadow of a person, only distorted, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. It was featureless, save for two eyes, glowing white, piercing through the blackness. It hovered in front of him, its form flickering like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. It was neither solid nor intangible, yet it felt like it had always been there, lurking just beyond his reach. Darren's breath hitched. The key pulsed harder, a sharp thrum in his chest. This wasn't just a creature. This was part of something older, something ancient. A guardian. Or perhaps, something worse. Darren, Ramirez whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The creature raised its arm, extending its long, bony fingers toward him, and Darren's body froze. He couldn't move. The key was no longer just a physical object, it had become part of him. A connection, a bond that tied him to this place. And then the creature spoke, its voice a soft whisper in the back of his mind. Welcome, Darren. You are the chosen one. The time is near. The Watcher has waited for you. The creature's voice echoed in Darren's mind, chilling his spine. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a voice in the traditional sense. It was a presence, an alien sensation that cut through everything, a truth that was too immense to comprehend fully. The words vibrated in his chest, as though they were part of the air itself, part of the darkness that enveloped him. Welcome, Darren. You are the chosen one. The time is near. The Watcher has waited for you. The key in Darren's hand pulsed again, sharper now, its light cutting through the oppressive shadows. He could feel the heat radiating from it, almost burning his skin. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to let it go. It was his anchor, and without it, he felt like he would lose himself in the void. The creature, or whatever it was, hovered before him. Its long, gnarled limbs twisted in unnatural directions, and its glowing white eyes bore down on him with an intensity that felt both distant and invasive, like it was searching the very depths of his soul. Behind him, Ramirez's breath was shaky. She wasn't sure whether to run or stay. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Darren, what is this? What's happening? But Darren didn't answer her. His gaze was locked on the creature. Every instinct in his body told him to run, to get out of there, but something held him there, something far stronger than fear, an overwhelming curiosity, a compulsion to understand, to know what this was all leading to. He had felt it from the very beginning. There was something inevitable about it, something about the house, the symbols, the key, it had all been pulling him here, leading him down this path that seemed too impossible to believe, but too real to ignore. The creature took another slow step toward him, its body flickering like a distorted reflection. As it moved, the very air around it seemed to bend, distorting the space between them. Time itself felt out of sync, like the minutes were stretching, warping into something alien. The key in Darren's hand flared brighter, but despite the light, it couldn't push back the overwhelming shadows. You are the one, the creature repeated, its voice drifting into his thoughts like an uninvited echo. You will open the gate. The Watcher has waited for this moment, for this very moment. The time is now. Darren's mind spun. The Watcher? He had seen him in the photographs, heard his name in the whispers, but it never felt real until now. The man in the hat. The figure that had been shadowing him since the very first moment he stepped into the house. The one whose presence lingered, unseen, in the corners of his mind. You have been chosen, Darren, the creature continued. The gate cannot open without the chosen one. You hold the key. The key. He could feel it throbbing in his hand. The symbols on it, the eye, the spirals, the intricate design, all of it was starting to make sense. It was not just a key. It was a symbol of something greater, something that had existed long before the house, before the photographs, before the woman in the room. It was ancient. But before Darren could say anything, the creature raised its arm and pointed toward the abyss beyond the door. The void, the place that had once felt like nothing, now seemed to pulse with purpose. The darkness was not empty. It was alive. The creature's voice grew louder, more insistent. Open the gate, Darren. The Watcher is waiting. You are the one who will bring the world beyond to this realm. The time has come for the old ones to awaken. A cold chill washed over Darren. The air grew even colder, and his heartbeat quickened. He wasn't just dealing with an old house or a mystery about an abandoned woman. He wasn't just looking at photographs and symbols anymore. This was something far older than anything he could have imagined. The Watcher. The Gate. The time for the old ones had come. He could feel it now. Something was awakening. The very fabric of reality seemed to shift. As though he was standing on the threshold of something he couldn't comprehend. It was like the world was about to change, and all he had to do was unlock it. Darren turned to look at Ramirez. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She could see what he was seeing. She could feel it too. She reached out, her voice trembling. Darren, please, whatever this is, it's not you. This isn't who you are. Don't listen to it. But Darren couldn't tear his gaze away from the abyss. The darkness was calling him, and the pull was too strong. He had to do this. With a trembling hand, Darren raised the key and stepped toward the gate. No, Ramirez whispered, backing away. Darren, don't. You don't know what's on the other side. You don't know what will happen if you open it. But Darren didn't stop. The key glowed brightly in his hand as he approached the door. The creature was still watching, hovering, its white eyes fixated on him. The moment Darren's hand touched the surface of the gate, there was a deafening sound, like the earth itself was breaking apart. The key hummed, its energy rising to a crescendo that shook the very air around them. And then, with a sickening twist, the door opened. At first, there was nothing. Just the same vast emptiness, the same overwhelming darkness. But then, something began to emerge. It started slowly, like a ripple in the fabric of the void. Then, it grew. And as it did, the shape began to take form. Figures. Shapes. They were not human, but they were alive. They were moving toward the gate, their bodies writhing and twisting, as though they were being pulled into the world they had been waiting for. Darren could feel them. Feel their presence. They were old. Ancient. Beyond human comprehension. They were creatures of the dark, forgotten gods, things that had once ruled over this world before it had been banished into the depths of time. And now, they were coming back. The gate began to widen, and the first figure emerged fully. It was massive, towering above Darren, its form shifting like liquid shadows. It had a face, or something that looked like a face. But its eyes were voids, black holes that seemed to suck in the light. It reached out toward Darren, its hand long and gnarled, a touch of its fingers sending a shock of cold through him. The creature spoke, but it was not with words. Its voice was felt. You have unlocked us, it said, its voice thrumming in Darren's mind. The time is here. The old ones will return. The world will never be the same. Ramirez screamed from behind him, but Darren could hardly hear her. He was overwhelmed by the sight before him, by the creatures that were emerging from the void. But then, in a moment of clarity, Darren realized something. The Watcher. The one who had been guiding him. The one who had chosen him. Darren understood now. The Watcher was not the end. The Watcher was the beginning. He wasn't there to control Darren or manipulate him. He was there to prepare him for the awakening of the old ones. The creatures that had ruled before humanity's time. They had been waiting, and now their time had come. Darren had opened the gate. And the world, as they knew it, would never be the same again. Lesson: some doors should never be opened. Some secrets are better left untouched. And sometimes, the greatest mysteries of life are not to be solved, they are to be left undisturbed.